In the dusty basement of the Colorado Historical Society, archivist Margaret Holloway had spent the better part of 3 decades cataloging the remnants of the American frontier, daguerreotypes of stern-faced pioneers, faded photographs of mining camps, and countless images of saloons that had once served as the social centers of forgotten boomtowns. But on this particular autumn morning, as she carefully examined a collection recently donated by the estate of a deceased collector, one photograph would challenge everything she thought she understood about the documented history of the Old West. The photograph appeared to be a typical saloon portrait from 1889, taken in what the faded notation on the back identified as Deadwood Gulch, a mining settlement in the Colorado Territory that had vanished from maps decades ago. The image showed the interior of a frontier drinking establishment, complete with a long wooden bar, ornate mirror behind it, and the usual collection of patrons one might expect to find in such a place during the height of the gold rush era. Margaret adjusted her archival gloves and positioned the photograph under her magnifying lamp, beginning her standard documentation process. The technical quality was remarkably good for frontier photography of that era, suggesting the work of a skilled professional rather than an amateur. The composition captured the entire length of the saloon, from the batwing doors at the entrance to the poker tables in the back corner, with natural lighting streaming through dirty windows, creating dramatic shadows across the scene. As she began cataloguing the figures in the photograph, Margaret noted the typical cast of characters one would expect to find in a frontier saloon. There was a bartender in a white apron polishing glasses behind the bar, several men in work clothes and wide-brimmed hats clustered around tables, and what appeared to be a woman in an elaborate dress standing near the piano in the corner. The scene captured a moment of everyday life in the American frontier, preserved for posterity by the relatively new art of photography. But as Margaret continued her examination, her attention was drawn to a figure standing at the far end of the bar, partially obscured by the shadows cast by the overhead oil lamps. Unlike the other patrons who appeared to be engaged in conversation or drinking, this individual stood perfectly still, facing directly toward the camera with an expression that seemed oddly out of place in the casual atmosphere of the saloon. The figure wore what appeared to be a sheriff's badge on his vest, clearly visible even in the dim lighting of the establishment. This in itself was not unusual, as lawmen frequently patronized saloons in frontier towns, often using them as informal meeting places to conduct business or gather information. But something about this particular figure made Margaret pause in her cataloguing work. She reached for her high-resolution scanner, a piece of modern equipment that could capture details invisible to the naked eye and create digital files that could be enhanced far beyond the capabilities of traditional photographic analysis. As the scanner processed the image, creating a digital version with unprecedented clarity, Margaret found herself studying the sheriff's figure with growing unease. When the enhanced image appeared on her computer screen, Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. The sheriff's face, now clearly visible in the digitally enhanced photograph, showed features that seemed somehow wrong for a living person. The skin appeared too pale, almost translucent, and the eyes held a quality that Margaret could only describe as empty, as if they were looking at something far beyond the confines of the saloon. More disturbing still was the realization that while every other figure in the photograph cast clear shadows on the floor and walls around them, the sheriff appeared to cast no shadow at all. The lighting in the saloon was consistent throughout the image, with natural shadows falling exactly where they should, based on the position of the windows and oil lamps. But the area around the sheriff's feet showed no corresponding shadow, as if he were somehow not entirely present in the physical space. Margaret enhanced the image further, adjusting the contrast and brightness to bring out details that had been hidden in the original photograph for over a century. As the sheriff's features became clearer, she noticed other anomalies that defied explanation. His clothing, while period-appropriate, appeared to be in perfect condition, showing none of the wear and weathering one would expect from a frontier lawman's working attire. The badge on his vest was particularly striking, appearing to gleam with a metallic luster that seemed inconsistent with the dim lighting of the saloon interior. When Margaret zoomed in on the badge, she could make out what appeared to be text, though the letters were too small and unclear to read even with digital enhancement. Intrigued by these anomalies, Margaret decided to research the history of Deadwood Gulch and see if she could find any records that might explain the presence of this mysterious sheriff in the photograph. Her initial searches through the Historical Society's databases yielded limited information about the settlement, which had apparently been a short-lived mining camp that had flourished briefly during the Colorado Gold Rush before being abandoned when the ore played out. But as she dug deeper into newspaper archives and territorial records, Margaret began to uncover a more complex and troubling history. Deadwood Gulch had indeed been a mining settlement, but it had also been the site of several unexplained incidents that had been reported in the territorial press during the late 1880s. According to newspaper accounts from the period, the town had been plagued by a series of mysterious occurrences that the local population had been unable to explain. Miners reported seeing figures in the tunnels that vanished when approached. Residents claimed to hear voices and footsteps in empty buildings. Most disturbing of all, several people had reported encounters with individuals who appeared to be deceased members of the community, walking the streets as if they were still alive. These reports had been dismissed by territorial authorities as the products of isolation, harsh living conditions, and possibly contaminated water supplies from the mining operations. But the accounts were numerous enough and consistent enough to suggest that something genuinely unusual had been occurring in Deadwood Gulch during its final years of operation. Margaret's research led her to a particularly intriguing newspaper article from the Denver Post, dated October 15, 1889, just a few months after the photograph had been taken. The article reported that Deadwood Gulch had been completely abandoned overnight, with the entire population simply vanishing without explanation. When territorial marshals had arrived to investigate, they had found the town completely empty, with personal belongings and valuable mining equipment left behind, as if the residents had simply walked away from their lives. The article mentioned that among the missing was the town's sheriff, a man named Thomas Garrett, who had been appointed to the position just 6 months before the mass disappearance. Garrett had been described as a competent lawman, with experience in several other frontier settlements, but his background before arriving in Deadwood Gulch was apparently unknown to the local residents. Margaret felt another chill as she read this information. Could the figure in the photograph be Sheriff Thomas Garrett? And if so, what did it mean that he appeared to be standing in the saloon after the entire town had supposedly been abandoned? She decided to search for more information about Sheriff Garrett himself, hoping to find records that might help her identify whether the figure in the photograph matched his description. Her search led her to territorial law enforcement records, where she found a brief entry for Thomas Garrett that raised more questions than it answered. According to the official records, Thomas Garrett had been killed in the line of duty 3 months before he was supposedly appointed as sheriff of Deadwood Gulch. The record indicated that he had been shot during a confrontation with outlaws in a town called Silver Creek, and his body had been buried in the local cemetery. Yet somehow a man with the same name had appeared in Deadwood Gulch and taken the position of sheriff just months after the recorded death. Margaret stared at the computer screen, trying to process this impossible information. Either there had been a clerical error in the territorial records, or someone had been impersonating the dead sheriff in Deadwood Gulch. But neither explanation accounted for the strange anomalies she had observed in the photograph: the lack of shadows, the translucent appearance, the perfect condition of clothing that should have shown wear from frontier life. She decided to examine the photograph more closely, looking for any other details that might provide clues about the true nature of what she was seeing. As she studied the enhanced image, Margaret began to notice other subtle anomalies that she had initially overlooked. The other patrons in the saloon, while appearing to be engaged in normal activities, seemed to be positioned in ways that avoided direct interaction with the sheriff figure. No one was standing close to him, no one appeared to be looking in his direction, and the bartender seemed to be deliberately focusing his attention on the opposite end of the bar. More intriguingly, Margaret noticed that several of the other figures in the photograph appeared to be showing signs of distress or unease. A man at one of the poker tables had his hand positioned as if reaching for a weapon. A woman near the piano had her face turned away from the sheriff's direction, and her posture suggested someone who was trying to avoid being noticed. The overall atmosphere of the saloon, which had initially appeared to be one of casual frontier socializing, began to take on a more sinister quality under closer examination. The patrons seemed tense, watchful, as if they were all aware of something threatening but were trying to maintain an appearance of normalcy. Margaret enhanced different sections of the photograph, looking for additional details that might explain the strange atmosphere she was detecting. In one corner of the image, she found what appeared to be another figure that she had initially missed, someone standing in the deep shadows near the back door of the saloon. This second figure was even more difficult to make out than the sheriff, appearing almost as a suggestion of human form rather than a clearly defined person. But like the sheriff, this figure seemed to be watching the other patrons rather than participating in the social activities of the establishment. As Margaret continued her analysis, she began to develop a theory about what the photograph might actually be documenting. Rather than a simple portrait of frontier life, the image might be capturing a moment of supernatural encounter, a scene where the living and the dead were occupying the same space in ways that defied natural law. The idea seemed absurd from a rational perspective, but the evidence in the photograph was difficult to explain through conventional means. The lack of shadows, the translucent appearance of certain figures, the obvious distress of the living patrons, all pointed to something beyond normal human experience. Margaret decided to research the photographer who had taken the image, hoping to find information that might shed light on the circumstances surrounding its creation. The notation on the back of the photograph indicated that it had been taken by someone named J. Morrison, but provided no additional details about the photographer's identity or background. Her search through photographic archives and territorial records eventually led her to information about a traveling photographer named Jonathan Morrison, who had worked throughout the Colorado Territory during the 1880s. Morrison had been known for his skill in capturing frontier life, and his photographs were considered valuable historical documents of the American West. But Margaret's research also revealed that Morrison had disappeared in late 1889, around the same time that Deadwood Gulch had been abandoned. His photographic equipment had been found in his hotel room in a nearby town, but Morrison himself had vanished without a trace. The timing of his disappearance, so close to the events in Deadwood Gulch, seemed like more than mere coincidence. Margaret found herself drawn deeper into the mystery, spending hours each day researching every aspect of the photograph and the history surrounding it. She contacted other historical societies and museums, looking for additional photographs taken by Morrison or any other documentation of the events in Deadwood Gulch. Her inquiries eventually led her to a private collector in Denver, who claimed to have several other photographs taken by Morrison in the weeks before his disappearance. The collector, an elderly man named Robert Steinberg, agreed to meet with Margaret and share his collection, though he warned her that the images were disturbing and had troubled him for years. When Margaret met with Steinberg at his home, she found a man who appeared genuinely frightened by the photographs in his possession. He explained that he had acquired them at an estate sale decades earlier, not knowing their history or significance. But as he had researched their provenance, he had uncovered information that had left him deeply unsettled. Steinberg showed Margaret 3 additional photographs taken by Morrison, all apparently shot in Deadwood Gulch during the same time period as the Saloon portrait. Each image showed similar anomalies to those Margaret had observed in the original photograph. Figures that appeared translucent, shadows that fell in impossible directions, and living people who seemed to be reacting to the presence of something that shouldn't have been there. One photograph showed the main street of Deadwood Gulch, with what appeared to be a funeral procession moving down the center of the road. But the figures in the procession cast no shadows, and the living residents visible in the image were pressed against buildings and doorways, apparently trying to avoid the ghostly parade. Another image captured the interior of what appeared to be a general store, where a figure in mining clothes stood among the shelves, while the store's proprietor cowered behind the counter. The miner's clothing was covered in what looked like grave dirt, and his face showed the unmistakable signs of advanced decomposition. The third photograph was perhaps the most disturbing of all. It showed the town's cemetery, where numerous figures could be seen standing among the headstones. Some of these figures appeared to be emerging from the ground itself, while others stood in positions that suggested they were guarding or watching over the graves. Steinberg explained that his research had revealed that Deadwood Gulch had been built on land that had previously been used as a burial ground by local Native American tribes. The mining operations had disturbed numerous graves, and the settlers had simply built their town over the desecrated burial sites without regard for the cultural and spiritual significance of the location. According to Steinberg's research, the strange occurrences in Deadwood Gulch had begun shortly after the mining operations had reached their deepest levels, disturbing graves that had been undisturbed for centuries. The appearance of ghostly figures had coincided with reports of unusual sounds and voices coming from the mines themselves. Margaret studied the additional photographs with growing unease, noting the consistency of the anomalies across all of Morrison's work from that period. The photographer had apparently been documenting something genuinely supernatural, capturing images of the dead, interacting with the living in ways that defied explanation. But what had happened to Morrison himself? And why had the entire population of Deadwood Gulch disappeared so suddenly and completely? Steinberg shared one final piece of information that sent chills down Margaret's spine. Among Morrison's personal effects, which had been found in his hotel room after his disappearance, was a journal in which he had recorded his observations about the strange events he had been witnessing and photographing in Deadwood Gulch. The journal entries, which Steinberg had obtained copies of through his research, painted a picture of a photographer who had initially been excited by the opportunity to document unusual phenomena, but who had gradually become terrified by what he was witnessing. Morrison's final entries described his growing conviction that the dead were not simply appearing in Deadwood Gulch, but were actively recruiting the living to join them. According to Morrison's journal, the ghostly figures were not content to simply coexist with the living residents of the town. They were systematically working to convince or compel the living to cross over into death, using methods that Morrison found difficult to describe or understand. The photographer's final entry, dated just days before his disappearance, expressed his intention to leave Deadwood Gulch immediately and never return. He wrote that he had come to believe that his very act of photographing the supernatural events was somehow strengthening the connection between the world of the living and the world of the dead, making it easier for the ghostly figures to influence and ultimately claim the living residents. Margaret felt a chill as she read Morrison's final words. The photographer had apparently realized that his documentation of the supernatural events was not simply recording them, but was actually contributing to their power and influence. By capturing images of the dead, he had somehow made them more real, more present in the world of the living. This realization raised disturbing questions about Margaret's own research. By studying and enhancing Morrison's photographs, was she somehow continuing the process that he had begun? Was her analysis of the images giving new strength to the supernatural forces that had claimed Deadwood Gulch over a century ago? Margaret tried to dismiss these concerns as the product of an overactive imagination influenced by the disturbing nature of the photographs. But as she continued her research, she began to notice strange occurrences in her own life that seemed to echo the events described in Morrison's journal. She started seeing figures in her peripheral vision, shadowy forms that vanished when she turned to look at them directly. She heard footsteps in the empty corridors of the Historical Society building, sounds that had no apparent source. Most disturbing of all, she began to have dreams about Deadwood Gulch, vivid nightmares in which she walked the abandoned streets while ghostly figures watched her from doorways and windows. Margaret tried to convince herself that these experiences were simply the result of stress and overwork, the natural consequence of spending too much time focused on disturbing historical materials. But the experiences became more frequent and more intense as she continued her research, suggesting that something more than psychological stress might be involved. She decided to consult with colleagues at other institutions, hoping to find someone who might have encountered similar phenomena in their own research. Her inquiries led her to Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a folklore specialist at the University of Colorado, who had studied supernatural beliefs and experiences in frontier communities. Dr. Warren listened to Margaret's account with interest and concern, explaining that she had encountered similar cases in her own research. According to Warren, there were documented instances of historical artifacts and photographs that seemed to carry supernatural influences, objects that could somehow transmit or amplify paranormal activity across time and space. Warren explained that certain traumatic events could leave what she called psychic imprints on physical objects, particularly photographs and other forms of documentation. These imprints could remain dormant for decades or even centuries, only becoming active when someone with the right sensitivity encountered them and began to study them intensively. The folklore specialist suggested that Margaret might be experiencing what researchers in her field called sympathetic haunting, a phenomenon where someone who studied supernatural events too closely could begin to experience similar phenomena in their own life. The process was thought to work through a kind of psychic resonance, where the researchers' intense focus on paranormal activity created a bridge between their own reality and the supernatural events they were studying. Dr. Warren advised Margaret to cease her research immediately and to distance herself from Morrison's photographs as much as possible. She warned that continued exposure to the images could strengthen the supernatural influences and potentially lead to more serious consequences. But Margaret found herself unable to follow this advice. Despite her growing fear and the increasingly disturbing experiences she was having, she felt compelled to continue her research, driven by a need to understand what had really happened in Deadwood Gulch and what Morrison's photographs were actually documenting. She returned to the Historical Society's archives and began a more intensive analysis of the Saloon photograph, using advanced digital techniques to enhance every detail of the image. As she worked, she began to notice additional anomalies that she had previously missed. The mirror behind the bar, which should have reflected the interior of the saloon, instead showed what appeared to be a completely different scene. In the reflection, Margaret could make out what looked like a cemetery, with numerous figures standing among the headstones. The reflection seemed to be showing not the current reality of the saloon, but some other place entirely. More disturbing still, as Margaret enhanced the reflection in the mirror, she began to see her own face among the figures in the cemetery scene. She appeared to be standing among the ghostly forms, wearing period clothing and looking directly out of the mirror as if she were aware of being observed. Margaret stared at the enhanced image in shock and disbelief. How could her own face appear in a photograph taken over a century before her birth? The rational part of her mind insisted that she must be seeing patterns in random visual noise, that her intensive study of the photograph was causing her to project her own features onto ambiguous shapes in the image. But the face in the mirror was unmistakably her own, down to details that could not be explained by coincidence or imagination. The image showed not just her general features, but specific characteristics that were unique to her appearance, including a small scar on her chin that she had acquired in childhood. As Margaret continued to stare at the impossible image, she began to understand what Morrison had realized in his final days in Deadwood Gulch. The photographs were not simply documenting supernatural events that had occurred in the past. They were somehow creating a connection between past and present, allowing the supernatural forces of Deadwood Gulch to reach across time and claim new victims. By studying the photographs so intensively, Margaret had somehow inserted herself into the supernatural narrative of the abandoned town. She had become part of the story that Morrison had been documenting, another victim of the forces that had claimed the entire population of Deadwood Gulch. Margaret tried to stop her research, to put the photographs away and forget about the mystery of Deadwood Gulch, but she found that she could not. Every time she tried to focus on other work, her attention was drawn back to Morrison's images. She felt compelled to continue enhancing and analyzing them, even though she now understood that doing so was somehow sealing her own fate. The supernatural experiences in her daily life intensified dramatically. She began to see the ghostly figures from the photographs in her own environment, standing in the corridors of the Historical Society, appearing in reflections, and watching her from the shadows of her own home. Most terrifying of all, she began to see Sheriff Thomas Garrett himself, the mysterious figure from the saloon photograph. He appeared to her exactly as he had in Morrison's image, wearing his badge and standing perfectly still while watching her with those empty, lifeless eyes. Margaret realized that she was experiencing the same progression of events that had claimed Morrison and the residents of Deadwood Gulch. The supernatural forces were gradually drawing her into their realm, using her own research and curiosity as the mechanism for her recruitment. She tried to seek help from Dr. Warren and other colleagues, but found that she could not adequately explain what was happening to her without sounding delusional. The supernatural experiences were intensely personal and subjective, impossible to document or verify through conventional means. As her situation deteriorated, Margaret began to understand that she had only one option remaining. She would have to find a way to break the connection between herself and the supernatural forces of Deadwood Gulch, even if it meant destroying Morrison's photographs and all the research she had conducted. But when she attempted to destroy the images, she found that they seemed to resist her efforts. Digital files that she deleted reappeared on her computer. Physical photographs that she tried to burn remained unharmed by the flames. The supernatural forces had apparently grown strong enough to protect their means of influence in the modern world. Margaret's research had revealed that the supernatural activity in Deadwood Gulch was not random or chaotic, but followed specific patterns and rules. The ghostly figures appeared to be bound by certain limitations, unable to directly harm the living, but capable of influencing them through psychological manipulation and the gradual erosion of their connection to reality. She began to study these patterns more carefully, hoping to find some weakness or vulnerability that she could exploit. Her analysis revealed that the supernatural forces seemed to be strongest when they were being actively observed or documented, but weakened when they were ignored or forgotten. This discovery led Margaret to develop a new strategy. Instead of trying to destroy the photographs, she would work to limit their influence by ensuring that they were never again subjected to the kind of intensive study that had awakened the supernatural forces. She would hide them away, bury them in the archives where they would be forgotten and ignored. But as she prepared to implement this plan, Margaret made another disturbing discovery. The supernatural forces were not confined to Morrison's original photographs. They had somehow spread to other images in the Historical Society's collection, infecting them with the same anomalous properties that characterized the Deadwood Gulch pictures. Margaret found ghostly figures appearing in photographs that had previously shown nothing unusual. Images of other frontier towns began to show the same translucent figures and impossible shadows that had marked Morrison's work. The supernatural influence was spreading through the archive like a contagion, claiming more and more of the historical record. She realized that her efforts to study and understand the phenomenon had inadvertently helped it to spread. By enhancing and analyzing the original photographs, she had somehow strengthened the supernatural forces and given them the power to extend their influence beyond their original boundaries. Margaret began to understand that she was facing something far more dangerous than a simple haunting. The supernatural forces of Deadwood Gulch were not just seeking to claim individual victims, but were working to corrupt the entire historical record, to insert themselves into humanity's collective memory and become a permanent part of the documented past. The implications were staggering. If the supernatural forces succeeded in their apparent goal, they could potentially rewrite history itself, creating false memories and fictional events that would become accepted as historical fact. The boundary between reality and supernatural fiction would become blurred beyond recognition. Margaret realized that she had become the unwitting agent of this corruption, her research serving as the mechanism by which the supernatural forces spread their influence. Every photograph she enhanced, every detail she analyzed, every pattern she identified, all contributed to the growing power of the entities from Deadwood Gulch. She tried to warn her colleagues about the danger, but found that they were unable to see the anomalies that had become so obvious to her. The supernatural influence seemed to be selective, affecting only those who studied the images with sufficient intensity and focus. Her warnings were dismissed as the products of stress and overwork. Margaret found herself increasingly isolated, the only person who could see the growing corruption of the historical record. She watched helplessly as more and more photographs in the collection began to show signs of supernatural influence, their original subjects gradually being replaced or joined by the ghostly figures from Deadwood Gulch. The supernatural forces seemed to be using her own expertise against her, exploiting her knowledge of photographic analysis and historical research to spread their influence more effectively. They had learned from her methods, adapting their techniques to match her analytical approaches. Margaret began to realize that her only hope lay in finding some way to reverse the process she had inadvertently started. She would need to find a method of removing the supernatural influence from the photographs, of restoring them to their original uncontaminated state. Her research led her to explore various theories about the nature of photographic images and their relationship to reality. She studied the work of early photographers who had reported supernatural phenomena in their images, looking for clues about how such influences might be countered or removed. Margaret discovered that several 19th-century photographers had developed techniques for what they called spiritual cleansing of photographic images, methods that were supposed to remove unwanted supernatural influences from pictures. These techniques had been dismissed by mainstream photography as superstition, but Margaret began to wonder if they might contain some element of truth. She experimented with various approaches, trying to find some way to restore the corrupted photographs to their original state. Some methods seemed to have temporary effects, causing the ghostly figures to fade or become less distinct, but the supernatural influence always returned, often stronger than before. Margaret's experiments revealed that the supernatural forces were not simply passive imprints left by traumatic events, but active, intelligent entities that could adapt and respond to attempts to remove them. They seemed to learn from each effort to cleanse the photographs, developing new methods of resistance and infiltration. As her research continued, Margaret began to notice that the supernatural influence was not confined to the photographs themselves, but was beginning to affect the physical environment of the historical society. She started seeing ghostly figures in the archive rooms, hearing voices and footsteps in empty corridors, and experiencing temperature drops and electrical disturbances that had no apparent cause. The building itself seemed to be becoming a conduit for the supernatural forces, allowing them to manifest in the physical world rather than being confined to photographic images. Margaret realized that her intensive study of the corrupted photographs had somehow created a bridge between the supernatural realm and physical reality. She tried to limit her exposure to the affected photographs, but found that the supernatural influence had grown too strong to be easily avoided. The ghostly figures from Deadwood Gulch now appeared to her regularly, both in the archive and in her daily life outside the historical society. During this period, Margaret began to notice that the supernatural manifestations followed certain patterns that seemed to correspond to the phases of the moon and other celestial events. The ghostly figures appeared more frequently and with greater clarity during certain times of the month, suggesting that their ability to manifest in the physical world was somehow tied to natural cycles. This discovery led Margaret to research the astronomical conditions that had existed during the original events in Deadwood Gulch. She found that the mass disappearance of the town's population had occurred during a rare celestial alignment, when several planets were in conjunction and a lunar eclipse was visible from the Colorado Territory. Margaret began to theorize that the supernatural forces were not simply random paranormal phenomena, but were connected to specific cosmic events that created favorable conditions for their manifestation. The original disturbance of the Native American burial ground had occurred during one such alignment, and the subsequent supernatural activity had been strongest during similar celestial events. This understanding led Margaret to develop a new approach to dealing with the supernatural forces. Instead of trying to fight them directly, she would work to predict and prepare for the times when they would be strongest, and use the periods of weakness to implement countermeasures. Margaret's research revealed that the next major celestial alignment would occur in just a few weeks, creating conditions that would likely strengthen the supernatural forces dramatically. She realized that this event might represent her last opportunity to break free from their influence before they became too powerful to resist. She began preparing for what she knew would be a final confrontation with the entities from Deadwood Gulch. Using her knowledge of their patterns and weaknesses, she developed a plan that she hoped would either free her from their influence or at least prevent them from spreading their corruption further. Margaret's plan involved using the supernatural forces' own methods against them. Just as they had used photographic documentation to spread their influence, she would use similar techniques to contain and redirect their power. She would create a comprehensive photographic record of their manifestations, but instead of enhancing and analyzing the images, she would deliberately distort and corrupt them, breaking the connection between the supernatural entities and their visual representations. The process would be dangerous, requiring her to expose herself to the full power of the supernatural forces during their period of greatest strength. But Margaret believed it was her only chance to prevent the entities from achieving their apparent goal of corrupting the entire historical record. As the celestial alignment approached, Margaret began to notice increased supernatural activity throughout the historical society building. Ghostly figures appeared more frequently and with greater clarity, and the temperature drops and electrical disturbances became more severe. The building itself seemed to be responding to the approaching cosmic event, as if it was somehow attuned to the same forces that had originally created the supernatural disturbances in Deadwood Gulch. Margaret's colleagues began to notice the strange occurrences as well, though they attributed them to equipment malfunctions and environmental factors. Several staff members reported seeing shadowy figures in the corridors, and the building's security system began registering unexplained motion detector activations and door openings. The night of the celestial alignment, Margaret remained in the archives after the building had been closed to the public. She had prepared her equipment and positioned herself in the room where Morrison's photographs were stored, ready to implement her plan when the supernatural forces reached their peak strength. As the alignment reached its maximum point, the supernatural manifestations intensified dramatically. The ghostly figures from Deadwood Gulch appeared throughout the archive room, no longer confined to photographic images, but manifesting as semi-solid apparitions that moved freely through the physical space. Sheriff Thomas Garrett materialized directly in front of Margaret, his empty eyes fixed on her with an intensity that seemed to pierce through to her very soul. For the first time since she had begun seeing him, the ghostly sheriff spoke, his voice carrying the hollow echo of someone speaking from beyond the grave. He told Margaret that she had been chosen to serve as a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, that her research and expertise made her uniquely qualified to help the supernatural forces achieve their goal of permanent manifestation in the physical world. He explained that the entities from Deadwood Gulch were not simply seeking to claim individual victims, but were working to create a new reality where the boundaries between life and death no longer existed. Margaret listened to the sheriff's words with a mixture of fascination and terror, understanding for the first time the true scope of what she was facing. The supernatural forces were not content to exist as mere ghosts or spirits, but were seeking to fundamentally alter the nature of reality itself, to create a world where the dead could walk among the living as equals. The sheriff offered Margaret a choice. She could join them willingly and help them achieve their goal, or she could resist and face the same fate as Morrison and the residents of Deadwood Gulch. He explained that her research had already made her partially connected to their realm, and that it would be a simple matter to complete the transformation and bring her fully into their world. Margaret realized that this was the moment she had been preparing for, the final test of her plan to break free from the supernatural forces' influence. She activated her equipment and began the process she had designed, using her photographic techniques to create distorted and corrupted images of the ghostly manifestations around her. The effect was immediate and dramatic. As Margaret captured and distorted the images of the supernatural entities, they began to lose coherence and stability. The ghostly figures flickered and wavered, their forms becoming less distinct and their presence less overwhelming. Sheriff Garrett reacted with surprise and anger, realizing that Margaret was using their own methods against them. He attempted to stop her, but found that his ability to interact with the physical world was being weakened by her photographic interference. Margaret continued her work, systematically documenting and corrupting the supernatural manifestations throughout the archive room. With each distorted image she created, the ghostly figures became less solid and less threatening, their connection to the physical world gradually being severed. But the process was taking a toll on Margaret as well. The intense exposure to supernatural forces during their period of peak strength was affecting her both physically and mentally. She began to feel disoriented and disconnected from reality, as if she were being pulled between two different worlds. As the celestial alignment reached its conclusion, the supernatural forces began to weaken naturally. Combined with the effects of Margaret's photographic interference, this created a window of opportunity for her to complete her plan and break free from their influence. With a final burst of effort, Margaret created one last distorted image that seemed to shatter the connection between the supernatural entities and the physical world. The ghostly figures vanished abruptly, and the oppressive atmosphere that had filled the archive room lifted like a fog being blown away by a strong wind. Margaret collapsed from exhaustion, but she had succeeded in her goal. The supernatural forces from Deadwood Gulch had been driven back to their own realm, and their influence over the Historical Society's collection had been broken. However, Margaret's victory came at a significant personal cost. The intense exposure to supernatural forces had left her permanently changed. her perception of reality forever altered by her experience. She found that she could still see traces of the supernatural world overlapping with the physical realm, though the threatening presence of the Deadwood Gulch entities had been eliminated. In the weeks following the confrontation, Margaret worked to document her experience and develop protocols for preventing similar supernatural infiltrations in the future. She collaborated with Dr. Warren and other researchers to create a network of institutions that could identify and contain dangerous historical materials before they could spread their influence. Margaret's research revealed that the phenomenon she had encountered was not unique to Deadwood Gulch. Similar supernatural infiltrations had occurred at archives and museums around the world, often triggered by intensive study of traumatic historical events that had left psychic imprints on physical objects. The network developed by Margaret and her colleagues began to identify patterns in these supernatural manifestations, creating early warning systems that could detect the presence of dangerous materials before they could affect researchers. They also developed techniques for safely studying such materials without triggering supernatural activity. Despite these precautions, new cases continued to emerge regularly. The boundary between the documented past and the supernatural realm seemed to be inherently unstable, requiring constant vigilance to maintain. Margaret found herself at the center of a growing community of researchers who worked quietly to protect the integrity of the historical record from supernatural corruption. The Morrison photographs remained in the Colorado Historical Society's collection, but they were now stored in a specially designed containment system that prevented them from manifesting supernatural activity. The images could still be studied, but only under carefully controlled conditions that limited exposure and prevented the kind of intensive analysis that had originally awakened the supernatural forces. Margaret continued her work as an archivist, but her role had expanded to include supernatural threat assessment and containment. She became one of the leading experts in identifying and neutralizing dangerous historical materials, her experience with the Deadwood Gulch entities serving as the foundation for new protocols and procedures. The dead sheriff of Deadwood Gulch had been contained, but his image remained as a reminder of the dangers that lurked within the historical record. Margaret kept a copy of the original Saloon photograph in her office, not as a trophy of her victory, but as a warning of what could happen when the boundaries between past and present became too thin. The photograph showed Sheriff Thomas Garrett standing at the bar, his empty eyes no longer threatening but somehow sad, as if he understood that his chance to escape the confines of death had been lost forever. The mirror behind him reflected only the interior of the saloon now, the ghostly cemetery having faded back into whatever realm it had emerged from. Margaret's final journal entries, discovered weeks later by concerned colleagues, described her growing realization that she had become trapped in the same supernatural web that had claimed Morrison and the residents of Deadwood Gulch. She wrote about her intention to travel to the site of the abandoned town, hoping to find some way to break the connection or at least understand what had really happened there. She theorized that the supernatural forces might be weaker at their point of origin, that the physical location of Deadwood Gulch might hold some key to understanding and potentially defeating them. Her plan was to visit the abandoned town site and attempt to perform some kind of ritual cleansing that might break the connection between the supernatural forces and the photographic images. Margaret's research had revealed that the original Native American burial ground beneath Deadwood Gulch had been considered sacred by the local tribes, a place where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was naturally thin. The mining operations had not only disturbed the graves, but had somehow torn open this boundary, allowing the dead to cross over into the realm of the living. She believed that the key to stopping the supernatural influence lay in somehow repairing this breach, in restoring the natural barrier between life and death that had been damaged by the mining operations. Her plan was to perform a ritual based on Native American traditions, hoping to appease the disturbed spirits and convince them to return to their proper realm. Margaret Holloway was reported missing 3 days after her final journal entry. Her car was found abandoned on a remote mountain road near the location where Deadwood Gulch had once stood. Despite extensive searches by local authorities, no trace of her was ever found. The photographs that had started her investigation remained in the archives of the Colorado Historical Society, filed away in a restricted collection that required special permission to access. The official records listed them as historically significant but potentially disturbing, requiring careful handling by qualified researchers. But sometimes, late at night when the building was empty, security guards reported seeing lights in the archive rooms where Morrison's photographs were stored. When they investigated, they found nothing unusual, just the quiet rows of filing cabinets and storage boxes that held the remnants of Colorado's frontier past. The Saloon photograph remained exactly as Margaret had left it, enhanced and analyzed down to the smallest detail. The figure of Sheriff Thomas Garrett still stood at the bar, watching with those empty eyes, waiting patiently for the next researcher who would be drawn to study his image too closely. And in the mirror behind the bar, careful observers could now make out additional figures among the ghostly forms in the reflected cemetery. Morrison was there, his camera still in hand. Margaret stood beside him, wearing the period clothing she had never owned in life. Both appeared to be watching, waiting for someone else to discover their story and become part of it. The mystery of Deadwood Gulch remained unsolved, but it was no longer a historical puzzle. It had become an active supernatural force, using the very human desire to understand and document the past as a means of claiming new victims across the centuries. The dead sheriff still stood at the bar, and he would continue to stand there, patient and eternal, until someone else was curious enough to look too closely at his impossible presence in a photograph that should have captured nothing more than a moment of ordinary frontier life. The truth about what had happened in Deadwood Gulch remained hidden in the shadows of the past, protected by forces that had learned to use human curiosity and the permanence of photographic documentation as weapons against the living. Some mysteries, it seemed, were better left unsolved, and some photographs were better left unexamined. But the images remained in their archive, waiting for the next researcher, who would be unable to resist the challenge of explaining the impossible, the next victim who would discover too late that some historical documents were not meant to be preserved, but to preserve those who studied them too closely. The dead sheriff watched and waited, his badge gleaming in the eternal lamplight of a saloon that existed now only in the space between documentation and reality, between the past that was recorded and the present that could still be claimed by those who had learned to exist in both worlds simultaneously. Years passed and the restricted collection remained largely undisturbed. The Colorado Historical Society had implemented new protocols for handling potentially dangerous historical materials, though the official explanations focused on preservation concerns rather than supernatural threats. Only a few senior staff members knew the true reason why certain photographs required special handling and limited access. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the folklore specialist who had tried to warn Margaret, occasionally visited the archives to check on the status of the Morrison collection. She had developed her own theories about the supernatural forces contained within the photographs, but she was careful never to study them too intensively or for too long. Warren had documented similar cases in other historical collections around the country, instances where traumatic events had somehow imprinted themselves on photographic materials and created ongoing supernatural influences. She had begun to develop a network of researchers and archivists who were aware of these phenomena and worked quietly to contain them. The network operated in secret, sharing information about dangerous historical materials and developing protocols for handling them safely. They had learned that the key to dealing with such materials was to limit exposure and avoid the kind of intensive analysis that seemed to strengthen supernatural influences. But despite their efforts, new cases continued to emerge. Historical photographs with impossible figures, documents that seemed to change their contents when observed, and artifacts that carried supernatural influences across time and space. The boundary between the documented past and the supernatural realm seemed to be growing thinner, perhaps weakened by humanity's increasing reliance on digital technology and electronic documentation. Warren theorized that the proliferation of digital imaging and enhancement technologies was making it easier for supernatural forces to spread their influence. The same tools that allowed researchers to uncover hidden details in historical photographs also seemed to provide pathways for supernatural entities to extend their reach into the modern world. The Morrison photographs remained the most dangerous items in the Colorado Historical Society's collection but they were no longer unique. Similar materials had been identified in archives and museums around the world, each carrying its own supernatural influence and posing its own unique threats to those who studied them too closely. The dead sheriff of Deadwood Gulch had become something of a legend among those who knew about such things, a cautionary tale about the dangers of delving too deeply into certain historical mysteries. His image served as a reminder that some aspects of the past were better left undisturbed, that not all historical questions were meant to be answered, but the human desire to understand and document the past remained as strong as ever, and new researchers continued to be drawn to the mysteries hidden in historical photographs. The supernatural forces that had claimed Morrison, Margaret, and countless others waited patiently for their next victims, knowing that curiosity and the pursuit of knowledge would eventually bring new prey within their reach. The Saloon photograph remained in its restricted file, the dead sheriff still standing at the bar with his knowing smile and empty eyes. In the mirror behind him, the ghostly cemetery continued to grow, adding new figures as more researchers fell victim to the supernatural forces they had tried to study and understand. The mystery of Deadwood Gulch had become something far more dangerous than a historical puzzle. It had evolved into a supernatural trap that used humanity's own desire for knowledge and understanding as bait, claiming new victims across the decades and adding them to its ever-growing collection of the lost and the forgotten. And somewhere in the mountains of Colorado, in a place that no longer appeared on any map, the ruins of Deadwood Gulch waited in the shadows, a physical anchor for supernatural forces that had learned to exist in the space between past and present, between the documented and the real, between the living and the dead. The dead sheriff would continue his eternal vigil, watching and waiting from his position at the bar, ready to welcome the next curious soul who would look too closely at his impossible presence in a photograph that had become a doorway between worlds, a gateway that remained forever open, forever hungry for new victims to add to its supernatural collection. In the depths of the Colorado Historical Society's archives, the Morrison collection waited in its climate-controlled storage, each photograph a potential trap for the unwary researcher. The dead sheriff's badge continued to gleam with that impossible metallic luster, a beacon calling out to those who sought to understand the mysteries of the past, promising answers, but delivering only eternal servitude in a realm where the boundaries between life and death had been forever blurred. The story of Deadwood Gulch had become a living thing, growing stronger with each telling, each investigation, each attempt to understand its impossible truths. And the dead sheriff stood ready to welcome all who would join him in his eternal watch, adding their voices to the chorus of the lost and the forgotten, the researchers and photographers who had looked too deeply into the shadows of the past and found themselves trapped there forever. The legacy of Margaret Holloway lived on in the protocols and procedures she had helped develop, the network of researchers who continued her work of identifying and containing supernatural threats within historical collections. Her sacrifice had not been in vain, as her methods had prevented countless other researchers from falling victim to similar supernatural traps. But the work was never finished, the vigilance never complete. New threats emerged regularly, new mysteries presented themselves to curious minds, and new victims were claimed by forces that existed beyond the boundaries of normal human understanding. The dead sheriff of Deadwood Gulch remained as a reminder that some doors, once opened, could never be fully closed, and some mysteries were better left forever unsolved.